Welcome to the world of Exa. Let's get into it. The Ihagee Exa cameras was a long-running series. It was a lower-cost alternative to the higher specified and more expensive Exacta. And those models had a very long life, I think running from I want to say the 30s on up until probably the 1970s. Like most of the East German camera industry, which is where these were produced, where all the X's were produced, it has a somewhat complicated history. That is due to the nationalization of the camera industry that occurred over time in East Germany. The Exa was a long-running camera series that was produced from 1950 until 1987 with a 7-year gap. That makes it very unusual in the fact that it went off the market for 7 years and then came back onto the market. And when it came back onto the market, it was sort of the same camera, but it wasn't. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Like many cameras, there are numerous variations within each model. Unlike some other cameras, there are numerous variations within each model. So I put together this chart to show you the number of variations within each model. And I was trying to sort of figure it out and try to count the number of submodels. And because it wasn't clear exactly how many there were, in some cases I put like up to a certain number. So it was 11, 12, 13, 14, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. There were up to 29 variations, or 29 submodels, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sort of major models, and up to whatever I just said, 21 submodels. So this was another case in which I abandoned the idea of ever trying to collect all the models because, well, that's just ridiculous. Anyway, let's start out with the first one, or what should be the very first one. Let's start out with this one, the Exa. This is one of the original Exa models. I don't know if this is actually the original Exa model, but I think this is one of the earliest models. As you can see, it bears a strong visual resemblance to the Exacta cameras. And why shouldn't it? Because it came from the same camera maker. Looking at the front of the camera, there appears to be a number of things going on, but let's just take a quick look to show you how it operates. This particular model, and in fact all of them except for I believe the Exa II models, use what's called a sector shutter, and I'll show you how that operates soon enough. Oh, I've added a small soft release here. Let me remove that for purposes of this video. Like the Exacta, it has a left-handed shutter release, which you might or might not like. This uses the same lens mount as the Exacta, and that's nice because that means you can use pretty much any lens that was made for the Exacta can also be mounted to the Exa. Like most of the other models, except for the Exa II and its variants, and the Exa II and the 2A and 2B, uses a pop-up viewfinder. In this case, the viewfinder is released by pushing this small button on the back. By the way, none of the Exa models had a rapid return mirror, but that wasn't expected in that era. You had to advance the you had to advance the film and tension the shutter in order to get the mirror to drop into focusing position. This had a small little magnifier, which you could then pop up into position via this little lever right here. This was a waist level camera, obviously. You could also remove the prism, or you can remove the waist level finder by pushing down this small tab here and simply removing the prism. If you notice, the focusing screen comes with it, which is just a plain ground glass screen. There are no focusing aids. So let's put that back on. Well, you know what? Let's close the viewfinder. That should make it actually a bit easier to reinstall this. The interesting thing about this is remember I tension the shutter, is that you cannot release the shutter unless you've opened up the focusing hood. So let's open that up again. And now you can see a simple depress of the shutter release on the front of the camera releases the shutter. This has a somewhat unusual shape to the body, in which it's truncated on the back, and it has a small little, I would say just a very slight arc on the front of the camera. It's a bit odd to hold because it's a very thick body. The speeds were modest, with the top speed being 1/150th of a second down to 1/25th of a second plus B. There were no slow speeds with most of the Exa cameras. As I mentioned, it's called a sector shutter. There have been other names for it, but from what I read, the correct name is a sector shutter. Ihagee used this small, in fact, you can see the manufacturer's name here. Ihagee used this same rib material that it used on some of the Exacta cameras. Sometimes you'll find that this material has come loose. You can just use a common adhesive to reattach it. And I think it was loose, maybe a bit on the corners, and I reattached it. So to open the back, let me see, it's been a while. Oh, we push down here, and the back pops open. On some of the cameras, the back is removable, but not on this camera. The take-up spool, however, is removable. Okay, it's pretty clean back here. You have your pressure plate, you have your film rails, and of course, you have your sprocket spindle. Take-up spool is a bit different in which there's this second piece that runs around here, and then you tuck your film under the film. You tuck the film leader under one of these little extensions here, and that's how you advance your film. That's how you load the film. So of course, remember the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against the film rails. So when you take your photo, it'll be as sharp as possible, and that is always dependent upon you having a lens of sufficient quality that it will record a sharp photo. Bottom of the camera is pretty plain. You simply have a tripod socket, and it is in alignment with the center of the lens. These are flash contact points, and this small lever releases the lens. Remember, this uses the Exacta bayonet. So that means any lens that you have for an Exacta can be used on this camera. Here I have a somewhat later Biotar, and this lens can simply be put on this camera like any other lens. I believe this Tessar was original to this camera. When I received it, it was heavily soiled, a little bit dirty and very oxidized, so I cleaned it up. Cleaned up very nicely, and as you can see, it's a coated lens because you can see the blue reflection. That makes it a coated lens. Okay, up here you have your frame counter. This is your film rewind button. This is knob rewind, so of course when you finish your roll of film, you have to press and hold this button while you turn the rewind knob. That makes it into a very laborious affair. The original Exa continued to be produced in roughly the same body style, I guess, same visual style, until 1960 when the Exa II was introduced. Let's take a look at the Exa II. We're only going to look at this briefly because I want to look at the Exa IIa, which has a functioning shutter. The difference between this camera and the previous camera is that it had a fixed pentaprism. There was no longer a waist level finder available, and in fact, as you can see, the viewfinder is not removable. So this is a fixed eye level prism. Still use the same mount. You only had a single flash contact point. It also uses a left-hand release, and like many of the Exa and Exacta mount lenses, it has this small little plunger to release the shutter. What made this different is it had a film advance, and I'll show you, let me show you the Exa IIb or 2A, because this one is not working. So you notice this one comes with the Meyer optic, I believe this is a Tommy plan. Pop open the back on this camera. Whereas the original Exa had a hinged back, this one had a removable back. Once again, the take-up spool can be removed. So what's different about this shutter? Keep an eye on it. Ah, what's that? Why, that is a focal plane shutter. Let's look at this original Exa. Pop open the back again. Okay, so in this one, if you notice, when you release, when you tension the shutter, first it drops the mirror into position. What you cannot see, so we'll have to look at it from the front, is it uses a small curved drum. It's almost like a drum. You can see how the mirror is attached to the front of that part of a drum. And that's why they call it a sector shutter. In fact, I can slide it up and down for you. This is not flat. That actually is a small curved piece of metal. And so when you press the shutter release, first the mirror flips up, and then just a single flap then flips upward. And depending on the speed you've chosen, the speed that you've chosen will determine how quickly that piece flips upward. The shutter on this 2A camera works very nicely. The one on the 2 doesn't work, but perhaps it can be repaired. So I'm going to see someday, probably won't be tomorrow, but I'll try someday to see if I can get it to work again. It's a bit difficult to read, but this does say USSR occupied. So this was made in East Germany. And of course, East Germany was part of the Soviet satellite block of nations. This camera is a bit larger than the original X, and we'll weigh them just to find out. You can see that it no longer says Ihagee on the front, although it does say here on the pentaprism. Now the Exa II, the 2A, and the 2B continued in production until 1966. There was an Exa 500 that was also sold as the Exacta 500 and the VX 200, make things even more confusing, as well as an Exa VX 100. And those cameras continued in production until 1970, at which point the Exa name disappeared. Notice how the same basic shape continues of the Exa. And like I said, these are smaller cameras than the Exacta. In fact, you know what? I'll show you an Exacta model in just a bit so we can get an idea of size comparison. So I mentioned that the Exa went out of production in 1970. In 1977, someone came up with the idea of reviving the Exa name, and so the Exa 1B was born. And this is the Exa 1C. The Exa 1C arrived on the market, after the Exa 1B came off of the market. The Exa 1B actually looked a lot like the 1C. Both cameras had pentaprisms as an option, or a waist-level viewfinder. Again, if you notice, with this particular camera, there are no focusing aids. It's just a flat matte screen. The Exa 2A had a very modern viewfinder screen. It had a split image in the center with a ground glass collar set on a Fresnel screen. This all made for a very bright image. It was very, very easy to focus, much better than the predecessor models and much better than the later models. Getting back to the 1C, which reportedly was produced by Certo, which by now was part of Pentacon. So the thing that set this camera apart from the others is the fact that it used a 42mm screw mount. That meant goodbye to the Exacta bayonet and hello to the universal 42mm mount. And it probably had to do with, probably was an economic decision, for production purposes, because this was would have been available for the Praktica cameras with the Exacta and Exa having been out of production for a number of years. It looks like, at least for the Exa, at least 7 years. So if the Exacta mount had been revived, lens makers would have been forced to reintroduce a second line of lenses for the revived camera. And it's doubtful that East German lens makers would have gotten the approval to produce a redundant second line of lenses merely for one camera. And that probably explains the reason to use the 42mm screw mount. Remember, the Exacta line of cameras had ended sometime in the early 1970s. On the left here was your shutter speed dial. So remember, the earlier version first had that gear shift that I like to call it. The Exa II also had a shutter speed dial here on the left. And because it was a because it was a focal plane shutter, you had a much wider available range of speeds. Running 250th of a second was your max speed, running down to 1/2 of a second plus B. With the return of these final two models, you once again return to a sector shutter. Your top speed was 1/125th of a second. Your slowest speed was 1/30th of a second plus B. Once again, there were no slow speeds. So you can see how this used the same type of shutter arrangement as the original Exa. That is, it used the sector shutter. In fact, let's put this on B. We'll open the shutter, then I'll release it, and there it is. In this case, the flap traveled vertically top to bottom, whereas the original went bottom to top. This also had a removable back. Come on. There we are. And the setup looks a lot like the others. Pretty much looks a lot like the original Exa. Once again, your film spool's removable, should you want to remove it. This has a small ball bearing that really holds it in place to make it so it's not that easy to remove. Ah, there we are. Setup is pretty much the same, right? Here's a little spindle with your sprocket things here, film rails, your take-up spool, and this helps guide the film across the film plane. You'll notice both cameras have something in common, which is this small lever to the left of the eyepiece. While this switch locks the viewfinder in place, of course it wouldn't have that same role here. What this is this is a shutter release lock. So when it's pushed down, you cannot push the shutter release. You cannot release the shutter. In each case, there's a small red dot that is exposed. Red means no-go. So in order to release the shutter, you then have to cover that red dot or push that small lever so it's no longer vertical. Now the Exa 1C, I can't remember, I think I bought the Exa 1C because it was the final model. That's why I bought this one instead of the 1B. Plus it took me a while to find one that was affordable. Bringing it all the way over from Germany, sometimes the shipping costs more than the camera itself. So what I usually do is I wait until I find one that has a reasonable cost for shipping, and then I wait. I think this one took about 6 to 8 weeks to arrive, so you just have to have patience. I actually like this camera quite. Oh, once again, it's that same Exa shape, I guess I should say. I actually like this camera. I like the original too. The second model, the Exa II and the 2A. For my purposes, I think they're a bit too heavy. When compared with the Exacta, you can see that the Exacta is a much wider camera than the Exa. It's also more complicated, and it certainly is more full-featured with a full range of shutter speeds. It has a focal plane shutter, whereas this has, as you recall, the sector shutter. But you can see the family resemblance, particularly when it comes to the scripting of the name. And, of course, the Ihagee Dresden engraving on both cameras. You'll also notice here that it has this same little lever here, or that's really a push-down lever to release the viewfinder. The viewfinder, I don't believe, I tried, and while it's interchangeable, it's not really a great fit, so I think I would just keep each of these waist-level viewfinders with their respective cameras. Although when you look at them from the top, they seem to be identical, so maybe it was just me just not being able to fit them in. You can also see how the body shapes are sort of like mirrors of each other. Whereas this one has the curved front, in this case, on the Exa, it's a curved back. And here, this is really a flat back, where this is, it's not quite a flat front, but it is slightly, I guess it has a slight curve, but you could say it's mostly a flat front. And some of the other differences, not only with this camera, but the other Exa models, is that this was a left-hand film advance, unlike the Exa, which always had a right-hand film advance, whether it be a knob or an actual film advance. This did not have the same limitation. That is, as far as releasing the shutter, you could always release the shutter with the focusing hood closed. I don't know if that was intended that way or if this camera actually has an issue. Could be that this was supposed to have the same safety feature. That is, you cannot release the shutter without having the film without having the focusing hood erected and in place. Because that does certainly seem to release a lot smoother than when I do this. Yeah, I think that actually is true. Looked like I was able to defeat that, but that probably was possibly because the part is worn and not because it was intended to be that way. I'm not sure if someday we'll have to take a look at this. I'm not sure what the intent of this is other than to keep this in a standoff position. Anyway, this video is not about the Exacta. It's really about the Exa. So let's see what these cameras weigh. Once again, I'm going to weigh only the bodies and not the lenses, because the lenses, of course, can vary in weight depending on which lens you attach to the body. Here we are with the original Exa, and that comes in at 1 pound 5.5 ounces. 1 pound 5.5 ounces. I can tell you that the Exa II, just from handling it, is a heftier camera and certainly weighs quite a bit more. How much more? This camera comes in at 1 pound 7.7 ounces, or 1 pound 8 ounces, which would really be, this is the Exa II-A, which would really be 1 pound, if we round up, 1 pound 8 ounces. Now, how about the earlier model, the Exa II? This is the 2A, if you recall. I'm going to guess that they're going to weigh roughly the same. Prove me right or prove me wrong. And prove me wrong. 1 pound 6.2 ounces. So going from the 2 to the 2A adds another ounce or so. Now the final model, the Exa 1C, that's the one with the screw mount. That weighs 1 pound 1.3 ounces. So this is the lightest of the bunch. And I thought it might be lighter, but I didn't think it would be lighter than the original model. How about the Exacta? This is the Exacta VX. So this camera tips the scale at 1 pound 10.3 ounces, and certainly you would expect that because this is a wider, larger, heavier camera and more full featured, and by its nature more complicated, more mechanically complicated than the other Exacta models. However, we will say that the Exa 2, that's Roman numeral 2, Exa 2, 2A and 2B, certainly a bit more complicated because those also had focal plane shutters. What makes the focal plane shutter of the Exa 2 and 2A and 2B unique, actually among many cameras, is that it's a vertically traveling cloth shutter. We often see a vertically traveling metal shutter. With this being produced in the 1960s, they probably hadn't yet developed the technology of a metal-bladed shutter. I selected these three because they represented the three most different body styles. Like I said, there were a lot of sub-variations of the original Exa, and there were a couple variations of this, and then this, of course, was an unusual camera because the line had gone off the market for 7 years before it came back. And it came back with a camera that was sort of similar, returned to that original sector shutter, but at the same time it came back with a 42mm screw mount. With a 42mm screw mount, of course, you had the advantage of not only to other East German lens makers, but also to that whole world of growing, by that time, right, 1977 to 85, 1977 to 87, which was the final year of production for this camera. So it not only opened it up for other German lens makers, but also to all those other Japanese lenses, right? So you had lenses made by Mamiya, in screw mount, Fuji or Fujika, also Pentax, obviously, and then also your third-party makers such as Vivitar, Chiron, and well, I'm not going to try to name all of them, but certainly many others. There also were a small number of 42 millimeter screw mounts made by Carl Zeiss, and that was for the SL706, which was iteration of the original Voigtlander Icarex. Many things in photography, the history sometimes is a bit messy, it's a bit confused, it's mixed up. There's always a lot going on, and this whole series certainly represents that. And it's very interesting how you have three different looking cameras, all bearing the same name. Also remember that none of these cameras had a built-in meter, but nor did any of the Exacta cameras, well, except for that last one, the Exacta RTL 1000. Once again, a very different camera from the other Exacta models. This was in some ways the most advanced of them, the Exa II, Roman numeral 2, Exa II, 2A, and 2B, in that it had a fixed pentaprism. It also had the best viewfinder of the bunch. You would expect it perhaps maybe this would have a pretty good viewfinder, but in fact, these two viewfinders share more in common than this. This, of course, has that split image, the ground glass circle on the Fresnel screen. Very modern viewfinder. Whereas these two really were, throwbacks to that era wherein you really didn't get much of a focusing aid. Well, you didn't get any focusing aid. So which of these cameras have I used? I've used this one. This one performed pretty well, as you might expect, with it being an older Tessar. You get whatever vintage image, it happens to produce for that era. So I thought the images were pretty sharp. For me, one of the biggest challenges of using the Exa cameras is figuring out how best to hold the camera. As I mentioned, these cameras are rather chunky. I guess that's the best way to describe it. That is, the body's very thick considering its size. It also has this portion that's truncated. The waist level finder actually works pretty well, considering that it's a left-hand release, so that's not a problem. So the challenge of the cameras with eye-level viewfinders is, once again, trying to figure out how to hold the camera securely while peering through the viewfinder. Because of the camera's size, you really cannot use your right eye. You must become a left-eyed photographer. When using your right eye, there's just no space to be able to hold the camera, peer through the viewfinder, focus the lens, and trip the shutter. And also, the body is not wide at all, so it doesn't give you that extra portion to grip. Instead, you're really left with just this smaller portion. And so placement of your thumb becomes a bit sort of weird because you have to get your eye up to the viewfinder, so you have to really move your thumb out of the way. Don't forget about this lever. This is the shutter release lock. And of course, you have a left-handed shutter release. So that wasn't a real problem. The real problem was just getting used to, or just finding a comfortable way to grip this camera while peering through the eye-level pentaprism. Not impossible, but just a bit of a challenge. This one's a bit easier because it's lighter in weight. As I mentioned, this camera was the heaviest of the bunch, and this was the this is the 2A. In fact, the 2A was heavier than the 2, I believe. The Series 2 cameras, Roman numeral 2, I don't even know why I keep saying Roman numeral 2, because there was not an Exa II that wasn't, there was a number, so I should stop saying that. In any case, because this is a heavier camera, then that becomes even more of a challenge. Good camera to use overall, but just keep in mind that it is somewhat challenged by the fact that it's somewhat heavy and it's a small, very small, compact body. And that brings us to the end of this video. And I hope you enjoyed this little walk down memory lane with the Exa. I was going to call it the Ihagee Exa, but that's not true. It was only these two models that were Ihagee, whereas this one was a Pentacon product. I really do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, think about giving me a like or subscribe on it. If you have a question or you'd like to leave a comment about these cameras, please do so below. Or if you'd like to write me personally, you can do so at contact@camera-talk.net. Don't forget to click that icon in the lower right corner of the screen for more content about cameras and photography. and I hope that you'll join me on my next video.